What would you do if a stranger in a perfect suit told you to be reasonable, while your neighbors are one storm away from losing everything? On a rainy night in Savannah, Claire Dawson, a lifelong Marshtown nurse, walks into a black tie fundraiser and does the one thing polite people never do. She tells the truth out loud. Right there, under chandeliers and fake smiles, she confronts a handsome developer about flooded streets, mold-filled lungs, and families who can't afford to be anyone's progress. Security pulls her away. The city turns her into a clip, a headline, a problem. And then Monday comes. Her first day at a new nonprofit job, when the board chair walks in, meets her eyes, and she realizes the man she challenged is her new billionaire boss. Stay with me, because that handshake is where this story truly begins. The first thing Claire noticed was the sound. Not the music, not the hum of conversation, those blended together like polished silver. It was the sound of heels on marble, a soft, elegant tapping she'd never quite mastered. Hers clicked too loudly, too quickly, like she was chasing someone, instead of entering a ballroom meant for pausing, smiling, and being admired. The Riverside Grand Hotel opened onto the Savannah River, and tonight its windows gleamed like a necklace of stars. Inside, chandeliers glowed above rows of tuxedos and sequined gowns. Champagne glasses chimed gently as donors congratulated themselves for supporting the future of coastal innovation. The whole place smelled faintly of money and magnolias, sweet, powdery, and just a little false. Claire Dawson tugged at the borrowed black dress she'd ironed 3 times. It wasn't fancy, but it fit, and that was enough. Her shoes pinched. Her pulse thudded. Every instinct told her she didn't belong here. She came anyway. The backdrop behind the stage displayed a shimmering image of the shoreline she knew by heart, marsh grass in the wind, egrets lifting from the water, the fragile strip of homes where her patients lived, and where, if tonight went the way the city boasted, bulldozers would soon stand. A young hostess in a sequin jacket handed Claire a program. "Welcome," she said brightly. "Enjoy the celebration." Celebration. Claire forced a small smile and stepped deeper into the ballroom. She ran her hand along the edge of a table, feeling the linen smooth, heavy, far nicer than anything she owned. Her throat tightened. All this sparkle, all this praise, built on the illusion that the new eco-luxury resort would bring salvation. For whom? Certainly not the people who spent hurricane season praying their trailers wouldn't float away. She drifted toward the balcony, needing a breath of air that didn't smell like catered oysters. That's when she noticed him. Tall. Clean lines. A tailored charcoal suit that fit so well it looked like it belonged to his bones. He stood half-turned toward the river, hands clasped loosely behind him as he listened to the mayor's speech. Silver threaded his dark hair at the temples, just enough to make him look distinguished rather than aging. He was handsome undeniably, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the way he stood so still, like the noise around him never reached his thoughts. Like he lived above it somehow. Just another man with too much money and too little understanding of the lives beneath him, she told herself. The mayor's voice boomed over the speakers. Tonight, Savannah takes another bold step forward. And we owe our greatest thanks to a visionary partner, Mr. Jonathan Hale of Hale Coastal Investments. Applause erupted. Claire's stomach dropped. Jonathan Hale, the billionaire, the man behind the resort project, the man whose decisions would uproot the little houses she drove past every day on her way to the clinic. The man who spoke of innovation while families packed plastic bins every hurricane season, praying their roofs wouldn't fly off. Jonathan stepped forward, accepting the microphone with a nod of practiced humility. He looked out at the crowd, calm, unreadable. She watched his mouth move as he thanked committees and investors, praising the project as a model of resilience, sustainability, and economic growth. Claire felt the heat rise behind her eyes. Resilience? She'd seen that word on grant proposals for years. It always meant the same thing. We're not actually going to help you, but we believe you can endure more. Thunder cracked across her memory, her mother's hands gripping the steering wheel, wind hitting the car sideways, the storm surge rising faster than the radio reports. Then months later, the cough. Her mother couldn't shake the mold that spread no matter how many times Claire scrubbed the walls. The quiet final morning when breath simply didn't come back. The mayor opened the floor for questions. No one moved. Of course they didn't. These events weren't about questions. They were about applause. Claire felt her hand rise before her mind caught up. A waiter near her blinked. A cluster of donors turned. Jonathan's eyes shifted in her direction, sharp assessing, surprised to see a woman whose dress didn't cost the price of a month's rent. She spoke before fear could close her throat. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice perfectly clear despite the tremor in her chest, "you talk about resilience. But where do you expect people to be resilient from when their homes are gone?" The ballroom froze. Jonathan lowered the microphone slightly. "I'm sorry I didn't catch your name." "Claire Dawson." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm a community nurse in Bay Ridge. The place your resort plans to improve." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some intrigued, some annoyed, some already filming. Jonathan's polite smile thinned. "Our coastal project follows all environmental regulations and includes job creation. For jobs don't help if there's nowhere left to live," Claire said quietly. "Your plans show elevation cuts that will worsen storm flooding. People in my neighborhood already sandbag their doors every season. Some were displaced permanently after the last hurricane. Families don't come back from destruction, Mr. Hale. They scatter." He inhaled slowly, his expression tightening. "Miss Dawson, our assessments were conducted by leading experts. With all respect, you may not be fully informed on the engineering process." "I'm informed on what happens to lungs after months of mold exposure," she answered. "On what unstable ground does to trailers. On how fear tastes in the air when the water rises fast enough to take a life." His jaw flexed. Irritation flickered across his face, followed by something else she couldn't place. Not anger, something colder, sharper. "Emotional anecdotes don't replace comprehensive planning," he said. "And expensive blueprints don't erase the truth," she replied. A hush fell so deep she could hear the clink of ice in a distant glass. His gaze locked with hers, steel meeting fire. For a moment the entire room seemed to tilt, as if the bright world of chandeliers and confidence had been cracked open by something raw and uninvited. Phones lifted higher. "Miss Dawson," Jonathan said, lowering his voice, "this isn't the forum for debate." "Funny," she murmured, "it seems like the perfect one." Security approached, not rough, just firm. A hand on her elbow. "A quiet, ma'am, let's step outside." She let them guide her back toward the entrance. Her heart was beating too fast, her breath trembling, but she didn't look away. Not until the last second. Jonathan Hale stood where she'd left him, microphone lowered, his expression unreadable. Gone was the polished smile. Gone was the easy authority. He watched her leave with a look that wasn't annoyance anymore. It was something unsettled, something she could not yet name. Sunday morning arrived quietly, the way Savannah Sundays often did. Sunlight warming the blinds, gulls calling somewhere near the river, the air carrying a softness that usually eased Claire's breath. But this morning, calm had no room to land. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, knees drawn close, phone in hand. The ceramic mug beside her had gone cold. She couldn't remember drinking from it. On the screen the video played again, her own voice sharp but steady, rising above the ballroom noise. "Jobs don't help if there's nowhere left to live." Someone had zoomed in just enough to catch the look on Jonathan Hale's face when she said it. Surprise, irritation, and that flicker of something else she still couldn't name. The clip looped endlessly, shared by local stations and half a dozen community pages. The comments were a storm of their own. "She's brave. Finally someone said it. She clearly doesn't understand economics. Good for her. Those folks out there need a fighter. Typical. Wants progress without sacrifice. Who is she? She looks familiar." Claire exhaled shakily. She pushed the phone away, but it felt as if the voices followed her across the room, a swarm of strangers pulling at the single moment she couldn't take back. Her mind leapt to her new job. She had signed the offer letter only 2 weeks ago, community health coordinator at Coastal Futures Alliance, a nonprofit that actually listened to neighborhoods like Bay Ridge. She'd believed she was stepping into a place where her experience mattered. But now, what if they saw her as a liability, a troublemaker, a risk? She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to will the dread away. Her mother used to say, "Truth has its own weight, Claire. Don't be afraid when people feel it." But the truth didn't pay rent. and it certainly couldn't protect a job she hadn't even started yet. Her phone buzzed again. Another share. Another caption. She turned it face down. By Sunday night, she'd rehearsed 3 different versions of an apology email she didn't want to write. She drafted none of them. Sleep came in short, broken pieces. Monday morning, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of weather that made the river look like tarnished pewter. Claire parked 2 blocks away from the office, needing the walk to steady herself. Her sneakers hit the uneven brick sidewalk. The scent of damp earth rose from the moss. Coastal Futures Alliance operated out of a renovated warehouse, red brick, big windows, the faint rumble of passing freight trains, always somewhere nearby. Claire had loved it the first time she visited. It felt grounded, real. The opposite of the ballroom. Today her feet hesitated at the door. Inside conversations dipped the moment she stepped in. Not mockingly, just curiously. But curiosity could sting too. A young program assistant whispered to someone by the copier. Claire caught a few words. The nurse from the video. Her chest tightened. She kept walking. At her new desk, a modest corner near the window, someone had left a welcome plant with a handwritten note. "Glad you're here, Shelley." The kindness nearly undid her. She drew in a careful breath and set her bag down. "Claire," she turned. Marilyn Pierce stood in the doorway of her office, silver hair pulled back, glasses perched low on her nose. 60-something steady as wintertide, Marilyn had interviewed her with both warmth and razor-sharp questions. "Step into my office for a moment." Claire followed, bracing herself. The door closed gently behind them. Marilyn didn't sit. She leaned against the edge of her desk, folding her arms, not defensive but thoughtful. "Rough weekend?" she asked. Claire nodded. "If I caused trouble for the organization, I'm sorry. I didn't plan any of that. I just couldn't stay quiet." "Good." Marilyn's voice held not even a flicker of reprimand. "We hired you because you don't stay quiet. Because you know what these issues look like on the ground. Don't apologize for having a spine." Relief hit so suddenly, it almost made Claire dizzy. She blinked it back. Marilyn's expression softened. "Let people talk. They'll forget by Tuesday. Savannah loves a moment, but it doesn't hold on to them long." For the first time that morning, Claire almost smiled. "Now," Marilyn continued, "we have a full team meeting at 9 sharp. I want you there. We're introducing our board chair for the year. Big funding cycle ahead, so all hands present." Claire nodded, smoothing the front of her blouse as she followed Marilyn to the conference room. Her pulse had steadied. She could make it through this. She could start fresh. She could. Her thoughts stopped completely when she stepped inside. Half the staff was already seated. The long table gleamed under hanging Edison lights. Folders sat neatly at each chair. Marilyn took her place at the head. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to introduce someone who will be important to all of us this year. Our newly appointed board chair and principal funder, Mr. Jonathan Hale." Claire's breath froze. He walked in with the same measured steps she remembered, precise, almost too quiet for a man with such presence. He wore a navy suit, this time no tie, the top button undone. His gaze moved across the room like a sweep of cold wind, efficient, controlled. Then, it landed on her. For an instant, neither moved. No one else understood the sudden charge in the room. The invisible cord pulled taut between them. Someone near Claire whispered a soft, impressed "oh," assuming it was admiration. Jonathan's face remained perfectly neutral as he reached the table, offering a polite nod to the staff. "Thank you for having me. I look forward to supporting the work you do." His voice was the same, smooth, composed, with an undertone of steel. Then he extended his hand across the table toward her. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I trust you're settling in." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't warmth either. It was unreadable. She placed her hand in his. The handshake was brief, cool, professional, yet something in his eyes flickered. Not anger. Not discomfort. Something more cautious, as though he hadn't expected to see her here any more than she'd expected him. She pulled her hand back slowly. Her stomach dropped cold, heavy, irreversible. The man she'd confronted in front of the entire city. The man whose project she'd accused of endangering families. The man she'd assumed she'd never see again. He was now in every practical sense her boss. And the room had no idea. The first planning meeting began with the soft scrape of chairs and the rustle of paper sounds that should have felt ordinary. But nothing felt ordinary with Jonathan Hale at the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply brought the room to attention the way a shift in tide commands the riverbanks quietly, undeniably. "Let's begin," he said, glancing at the agenda. "If we expect to influence public policy, we need accuracy, data, not sentiment." His tone wasn't unkind, just exacting. Claire felt her shoulders stiffen. She wasn't sentimental. She just lived closer to the consequences than he ever had. Charts and reports passed from hand to hand. When it was her turn, she slid a printed summary forward, her preliminary assessment of how displacement and shoreline loss affected chronic illness, especially among older residents. She'd stayed up half the night preparing it. Jonathan scanned the first page. Then he opened his pen. His notes were fast, precise, and merciless. "Define your sample size here," he said, tapping the margin. "This statistic references a study from 18 years ago. Do you have something more recent? And this section," he looked up, "correlation is not causation. You're drawing conclusions the data doesn't fully support." Heat crept up Claire's neck. "The patterns are clear." "Patterns," he replied, "are not enough." She forced herself to breathe slowly. "These are real people. I see the effects every day. And I'm not disputing that." He folded the report. "But if you expect city council or investors to listen, you must prove what you claim. If the foundation of your argument is soft, the structure collapses." Someone shifted uncomfortably. A pencil rolled off the table. Claire's jaw tightened. She felt the humiliation like a tightening band around her chest. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't dismissing her concerns. But somehow this public dismantling felt worse. Was this his revenge? A polished professional kind of punishment? He moved on to the next item, offering similarly pointed critiques to others, though none quite as sharp as the ones he had leveled at her. When the meeting ended, staff drifted out with murmured goodbyes and relieved exhalations. Claire gathered her pages slowly, willing her hands not to shake. She felt someone step beside her. "Marilyn, he's that hard on everyone," she said quietly, "including himself. You should see the notes he leaves on his own drafts." Claire swallowed. Still felt like being put on trial. "I know." Marilyn's voice softened. "But he wasn't attacking you. He was asking for the version of your work that you more than anyone are capable of." Claire wasn't sure she believed her. Not entirely, but she wanted to. The office emptied over the next hour. Lights flicked off one by one until only a soft glow remained above Claire's desk. She sat surrounded by scattered documents, her laptop humming faintly, the night pressing against the windows. She reopened her report. Maybe Jonathan had been right. Not about everything, but about enough. Her patients deserved a defense that couldn't be shrugged off by men in suits quoting coastal impact numbers. So she rebuilt her study. Hospital records from the past decade. Emergency room statistics during hurricane seasons. County health data, cross-referenced by zip code. Interviews from her notebook, carefully anonymized, turned into measurable indicators. Her fingers grew stiff. Her back ached. But the argument grew stronger, clearer. It took shape like a structure, finally finding its spine. Hours later, when the building was silent as the marsh at low tide, she printed the revised report and slid it under Jonathan's office door. The simple sound of paper against carpet carried more defiance and more hope than she wanted to admit. The next morning she arrived with a knot in her stomach. Had he read it? Would he ignore it? Would he tear it down again? She found him already in the conference room, jacket off, sleeves rolled above his wrists, reviewing a stack of files. He didn't look up immediately. But when he did, he held her report in his hand. He approached her with a steady, unreadable expression. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Then he gave a single deliberate nod. "This is much stronger," he said quietly. "Now, I can't ignore it." Just that. No smile. No apology. No softening. Yet somehow it was enough to shift something inside her, a small click like the first beam settling correctly into place. She wasn't sure if she felt vindicated or seen. and she wasn't sure which feeling scared her more. Jonathan moved past her to start the meeting, but Claire remained still for a long beat, her report warm in her hands, strong enough not to be ignored. The words echoed through her chest, opening a space she didn't expect, one filled not with anger but with a flicker of something unfamiliar. Something that felt dangerously close to respect. The storm rolled in heavier than the forecast had promised. By late afternoon, the sky hung low and bruised above Savannah, the kind of gray that swallowed color and made the river look like metal bending under its own weight. Alerts chimed across Claire's phone. Tornado watch. Flash flood warning. Tropical system strengthening offshore. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical bag, tossed a poncho in the passenger seat, and headed for Bayview Point. Her old sedan shuddered in the wind as she crossed the bridge toward the low-lying neighborhood. Bayview Point wasn't built for storms. It was a patchwork of aging cottages and double-wide trailers, some patched with plywood, others sitting on cinder blocks that had survived far too many hurricane seasons. She'd spent the last 5 years tending to the people here, people who didn't have the luxury of evacuation plans or flood insurance. Sheets of rain hammered her windshield as she pulled into the narrow gravel drive beside the Jenkinses' home. Water pooled fast around her tires. She tightened her hood and ran toward the porch. Inside, the elderly couple stood in a dim living room, surrounded by half-packed bins. "We've got to move your medications and the photos higher," Claire said gently. "Storm surge may hit harder this time." They nodded, trusting her, the way people do when trust is all they have left. She helped stack their framed pictures on a high-shelf wedding photo, grandkids, a faded portrait of Mr. Jenkins in uniform. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thin walls. Claire was reaching for a box of inhalers when a pair of headlights swept across the window. White light cut through the rain, then stopped. A truck door slammed. She felt her stomach tighten. No way. She stepped onto the porch just as a figure moved through the downpour, hooded raincoat, jeans, boots splashing through the growing floodwater. He carried 2 sandbags over his shoulder like they weighed nothing. Jonathan Hale. Not the man from the ballroom. Not the CEO with crisp suits and careful distance. Just a man soaked to the bone, mud smeared across his sleeves. He dropped the sandbags by the front steps and nodded once at her, rain dripping from his hair. "Heard. This street floods first. Thought I'd help. No cameras, no staff, no press release. Just him." Claire's breath caught, swallowed by the wind. "You came alone," he shrugged. Storm didn't seem interested in waiting until morning. For a moment she didn't know what to say. She'd built a whole argument in her mind about what kind of man he was. But that man didn't show up in a pickup truck during a tropical storm. Jonathan hefted another sandbag and moved toward the back of the house. Claire watched him wade through water, already climbing to his shins. The rain plastered his shirt to his arms, turned his hair nearly black. He didn't complain, didn't look around for acknowledgement. He simply worked. When he finished at the Jenkinses, Claire followed him down the street to check on Mr. Rodriguez, a disabled veteran who couldn't walk without assistance. Jonathan reached the door first, knocking twice before letting himself in gently. "Nate," he called, voice raised above the storm. "It's Hale. You all right, Claire?" Entered behind him to find the man sitting in a recliner, powerless TV flickering faint static. Jonathan knelt beside him, steadying the chair as the wind rattled the siding. "We need to move you away from the window," Jonathan said. "Let's get you to the hallway." His hands were careful, respectful. No hint of the cool detachment Claire had seen in meeting rooms. When they stepped back outside, water rushed over their shoes. Claire's heart hammered with a fear that had nothing to do with Jonathan. Fear for these people, this place, this fragile world that never caught a break. A scream cut through the rain. Claire spun toward a small yellow cottage, its porch light flickering. She ran Jonathan right behind her. Inside, they found Mrs. Harper clutching her bleeding arm, a fallen piece of metal gutter lying at her feet. "Sit down," Claire said quickly. "Let me see." Jonathan pulled out a flashlight, its narrow beam slicing through the dim room. The roof thudded overhead with branches and storm debris. Claire cleaned the wound, but she needed pressure. Wind pressed against the thin walls. The flashlight wobbled with each gust. "Hold this," she said. He angled the light with steady fingers as she wrapped the bandage. Their movements synced naturally, practical, focused, urgent. It struck Claire how strange it felt to work beside him like this. And how right. When the bleeding slowed, she exhaled. Mrs. Harper thanked them through trembling breaths. As they stepped into the hallway, the storm roared even louder, making the house shudder. Claire leaned against the wall, catching her own breath. "Why fund something that puts these people at more risk?" she asked quietly, eyes fixed on the doorway, not him. "You've seen what one storm does." Jonathan rested the flashlight against his hip. His face softened in the dim glow. "Because the alternative in my world," he said slowly, "is often worse developers, with fewer scruples. I thought I could control the damage by being part of it. I thought maybe I could push things in a better direction." His gaze met hers. "Maybe I was wrong." Something loosened in her chest, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first hint of understanding. A sudden crack split the air. A massive tree branch slammed onto the front porch, shaking the cottage from foundation to rafters. Dust and leaves burst into the hallway. Mrs. Harper cried out from the living room. Claire grabbed the wall to steady herself. Jonathan was already moving, checking windows, scanning for structural damage. For one suspended moment, they stood shoulder to shoulder, both aware of how little control either of them had over the storm, over the land, over the fragile lives depending on them. The house groaned under the wind, and Claire realized with an ache she didn't expect that nothing about this man was as simple as she'd wanted him to be. A week after the storm, Bayview Point was still drying out. The streets were littered with branches bleached by salt water, and the air carried that unmistakable post-storm scent, mud pine and quiet exhaustion. But life moved on. It always did. Claire arrived at the office expecting the usual Monday rhythm. Instead, Marilyn met her at the doorway with a warm but purposeful look. "Claire, I'd like you to join Jonathan for the listening session tonight. Trinity Fellowship Hall. Residents want answers, and you know the health implications better than anyone." Claire blinked. "You want me to go with him?" Marilyn smiled gently. "I want you to help him hear what he needs to hear." That evening, the fellowship hall buzzed with folding chairs scraping against tile floors and the murmur of anxious voices. The storm had cracked open people's fear, and tonight they were ready to pour it out. Jonathan stood at the front, not behind a podium, just near a table, hands clasped loosely, listening while residents spoke. Some were angry. Some were trembling. Some were simply exhausted. "My granddaughter can't breathe right when the mold comes back," one woman said. "My trailer shifted 2 inches off its blocks," another man added. "You build that resort, and where do we go?" Then someone demanded. Jonathan listened without interrupting. Claire watched his jaw tighten, the subtle crease forming between his brows. He wasn't unmoved. He wasn't unmoved at all. When the questions ended, the room emptied slowly, like water draining from a basin. Volunteers began stacking chairs. The fellowship hall, once so loud, grew dim under the few overhead lights left on. Jonathan stayed behind. Claire watched him lift chairs, 2 at a time, stacking them neatly against the wall. The expensive suit was gone tonight. He wore a simple button-down with the sleeves rolled and scuffed boots that still carried mud from Bayview Point. He moved quietly, methodically, almost as though the work steadied him. "You don't have to do that," Claire said softly as she approached. He didn't stop. "Neither do you." She lifted a chair beside him. They worked in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that held space rather than tension. When the last row was done, Jonathan rested his hands on the back of a chair and let out a slow breath. "My father died in an explosion," he said suddenly. Claire froze, not because of the words themselves, but because of how quietly he said them, as if he had spent years keeping them sealed away. "I grew up in a small town inland," he continued. "My dad worked maintenance at a chemical plant. There were warnings, ignored reports, corners cut to save money. One night, a valve failed." He didn't have to finish the sentence. Claire's throat tightened. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry." "Our neighbors brought casseroles," he said, almost smiling, "and the company brought lawyers." His eyes followed a crack in the linoleum floor, like he was tracing a memory long buried. "My mom fought them in court. She wanted accountability. She wanted someone, anyone, to admit what they'd done." He exhaled. "But the company had more attorneys, more experts, more everything. Did she win anything?" He shook his head. She learned that the truth doesn't always matter, not unless you can back it with leverage. Facts. Proof airtight enough that no one can twist it. Claire saw the missing puzzle piece slide into place. His obsession with data wasn't arrogance. It was armor. It must have been awful, she whispered. It taught me something, he said. Feelings are important, but they didn't save my family. Evidence might have, power might have. So I spent my life trying to build the leverage we didn't have back then. Claire let the weight of his words settle. She'd walked into this job believing Jonathan Hale didn't understand people like her patients, but maybe he understood too well, just in a different direction. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking suddenly unsure. I know people here think I'm just another man with a portfolio and a plan. But the truth is, I don't want anyone to lose what my family lost. She took a breath, steadying her voice. Then why does it look like your project is risking exactly that? Because sometimes, he said quietly, the choice isn't between good and bad. It's between bad and worse. And I thought wrongly maybe that being involved meant I could steer things toward the lesser harm. A folding table clattered at the far end of the hall. An older man in a faded fishing cap glared at Jonathan. You're all the same, the man muttered. Vultures looking for land to pick clean. Claire felt her pulse jump in instinctive agreement. But tonight, something tugged at her deeper. Something newly awakened. Before she realized she was speaking, her voice drifted across the hall. He's here, she said softly. He's listening. That's more than most I've seen. The fisherman paused, eyeing her with surprise. So did Jonathan. Her face warmed. She hadn't planned to defend him, hadn't even expected to feel the impulse. The words came from a place she didn't yet understand, a place that saw the man stacking chairs long after everyone else had gone home. The fisherman grumbled and left through the side door. Jonathan turned toward her, the faintest crease of confusion and something gentler in his expression. Not triumph, not gratitude. Something like being disarmed. You didn't have to say that, he murmured. I know, Claire said, picking up another chair and unable to meet his eyes. I'm not sure why I did. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, the hum of old fluorescent lights filling the space between them. Outside, the wind rustled, the church's worn wooden sign sending a soft creak through the empty night. Inside, Claire felt something shift, subtle, unmistakable, and entirely too close to empathy. The city council chamber was packed shoulder to shoulder, humid with tension, the air thick with a mix of perfume, sweat, and anticipation. People fanned themselves with folded agendas while cameras perched like metallic birds along the aisles. The resort project had become the center of Savannah's political storm, and tonight everyone wanted front row seats. Claire stood near the back, clutching her binder with the updated health report. Her palms were damp, her breath shallow. The last time she'd spoken in a room full of powerful people, she'd been escorted out. Tonight she had been invited, and somehow that felt even more frightening. Developers sat in press suits at the front table, their lawyers flipping through thick binders labeled with tabs, compliance, projections, impact. When the council chair banged, the gavel, conversation thinned to a hush. We'll begin with statements from Hale Coastal Investments, the chair said. Jonathan rose. He wore a dark suit again, but not the armor-like perfection from the gala. Tonight, he looked less polished, more human. A slight tension around his eyes betrayed how little sleep he'd had. His partners flanked him, men who looked like they lived and breathed leverage. Jonathan gave a brief nod and adjusted the microphone. Our team maintains that the project complies with every requirement set by state and federal regulators, he began. The developer's lawyers nodded firmly. A ripple of dismay passed through the residents section. Claire felt her stomach drop. Of course. What had she expected? That one storm and one late-night conversation could rewrite years of corporate momentum. That Jonathan would suddenly turn into an activist. She steadied herself. Her turn would come. The lawyers launched into polished monologues, erosion modeling, economic forecasts, mitigation plans. Their words flowed like a tide designed to confuse and overwhelm. When the council chair finally called Claire's name, her ears buzzed. She stood. Her shoes clicked softly against the tile as she walked forward. She opened her report with practiced calm. Our clinic has documented a 42% increase in mold-related respiratory cases following the last 3 storm seasons, she began. Elderly residents are especially vulnerable. Displacement isn't just inconvenient, it's fatal. A few council members watched with polite interest. Others didn't disguise their boredom. One leaned toward his colleague, whispering. Another bleeding heart nurse. We've heard this song. Claire swallowed the sting. She kept going. She showed data, charts, timelines. She forced her breath steady until her voice became a thin but unwavering thread through the chamber. When she finished, the silence was brief, too brief to be agreement, too short to be respectful. Then came the questions. Where exactly did you pull these numbers from? Do you have any formal environmental training? Isn't this speculative? At best, Miss Dawson. Her pulse quickened. These aren't speculations. They're patient histories, cross-referenced with storm surge data and displacement reports. A lawyer interrupted with a smooth, dismissive smile. Correlation is not causation. She felt heat rise in her face, the old humiliation from that boardroom, the familiar sense of speaking truth into a void that preferred numbers it could twist. Before she could respond, another microphone clicked on. Jonathan stood, except this wasn't the composed businessman she'd seen at countless meetings. This Jonathan looked sharpened, focused, as though he'd been hit with clarity so strong it cut through habit. I'd like to address that, he said. His partners turned toward him sharply. Miss Dawson's analysis, Jonathan continued, is not speculative. I reviewed her methodology myself. A murmur moved through the chamber, quick and electric. He kept going. In fact, her findings reveal gaps in our current assessment, gaps we must address if we claim to care about long-term coastal resilience. One of the lawyers hissed Jonathan, stick to the script. He didn't. Instead, he faced the council. My team knows I'm not fond of half measures. We talk about sustainability, but we cannot build a future by ignoring the present realities. Dawson's report demonstrates legitimate risks, risks that must be independently verified before we move forward. His partners stared at him in disbelief. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Therefore, Hale Coastal will not proceed with any development until a full third-party impact review is completed. And unless the final design includes community safeguards recommended by that review, we withdraw our participation entirely. The room erupted. Residents gasped. Some cheered. Council members exchanged startled looks. The lawyers looked like someone had yanked the floor out from under them. Claire stood frozen, unable to anchor her breath. He had just challenged his own investors, publicly, on record, for her patience, for a truth that had no lobbyists behind it. The council chair hammered the gavel. Order, please, order, but nothing could quiet the shock. After the meeting adjourned in a flurry of noise, Claire stepped into the hallway just in time to hear Jonathan's phone buzz violently. He answered. The voice on the other end was furious enough to bleed through the speaker. What the hell did you just do, Jonathan? You put tens of millions on the line. Our shareholders will revolt. You signed your own death sentence. Jonathan walked a few steps away, but not far enough to keep Claire from hearing. Yes, he said evenly. I made the call, and it was the right one. You're being reckless, the voice spat. Maybe, he replied quietly. But I won't be complicit by staying silent. The line went dead. Jonathan exhaled a long breath and pressed his hands briefly against his eyes. Claire watched him. Really watched. Not the CEO. Not the developer. Not the adversary from that night in the ballroom. But a man standing alone in a hallway, absorbing the full weight of a choice that might cost him everything. And for the first time, she understood what it meant for someone like him to take a stand. He wasn't just listening. He was willing to bleed. Jonathan lowered his hands and found her standing there, unable to hide the truth in her eyes. Something passed between them, quiet, heavy, unspoken. Before either could speak, another council member approached, pulling Jonathan into conversation. Claire stepped back, her breath unsteady. She'd come tonight ready to fight him. She left unsure of what exactly she was fighting anymore. The article hit Savannah like a lightning strike, sudden, blinding, impossible to ignore. Claire was standing in line at the corner coffee shop when the alert lit up her phone. Coastal investor hail tied to toxic site cover-up. The headline stretched across the screen in black letters sharp enough to cut. Her fingers trembled as she tapped it open. There it was. Jonathan's name, bold, centered, attached to everything she'd always feared about men with too much power. The exposé detailed a decade-old industrial redevelopment project in a small coastal town south of Charleston. A plant that had been converted into a processing facility funded in part by an early hail investment partnership. 10 years later, chemicals were found seeping into the groundwater. Families evacuated, photos of pale, sick children lying in hospital beds. Reports of tumors, respiratory conditions, lawsuits filed. Settlements paid. And Jonathan's signature, digitized but unmistakable, appeared on multiple oversight documents. The room around Claire blurred. She barely registered the barista calling her name. Coffee in hand, she stepped outside into the cold morning air, trying to breathe through the rising pressure in her chest. She scrolled further. Jonathan's statement appeared at the bottom of the article. I was not directly managing the site. Oversight was delegated to a partner whose negligence I discovered too late. I take responsibility for failing to act sooner. The consequences of that failure changed the direction of my entire investment strategy. Claire closed her eyes. She saw two images warring in her mind. Jonathan in the truck headlights, during the storm, carrying sandbags through knee-deep water, and Jonathan's name beneath a paragraph describing poisoned groundwater. Her stomach twisted. At the office, the air felt brittle when she walked in. Staff huddled in clusters, speaking in low tones. Screens glowed with the same article she'd just read. The usual warmth of the brick-walled space had vanished, replaced with something colder. Shelley approached her with wide, uneasy eyes. You saw it, Claire nodded. It's bad, Shelley whispered. Like, really bad. Marilyn called an emergency meeting. Inside the conference room, the tension was palpable. Folders lay unopened. No one reached for the pastries usually placed in the center of the table. Marilyn stood at the front, still composed but with a heaviness Claire hadn't seen before. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Marilyn said. You've likely read the article. We've already received calls from 3 major donors requesting clarification about our relationship with Mr. Hale. Someone exhaled sharply. Another staffer raised a hand. Are we going to ask him to step down? Marilyn didn't answer immediately. She removed her glasses, folded them, and set them gently on the table. We need to discuss all options. The words dropped like stones. Claire stared at her hands, feeling the ground tilt beneath her. She shouldn't feel anything. Not after what she'd just read. But her mind kept drifting to the storm. The sandbags. The genuine fear in Jonathan's voice when he talked about his father, about what negligence cost his family. Was that the same man who let a toxic site slip through his fingers? Or had he been someone else, then someone younger, more reckless, less willing to question the people he partnered with? A voice cut through her thoughts. He signed those documents, said Rick, the development strategist. Intentional or not, people were hurt. Donors don't want that stain on us. We can't ignore it, another added. Our reputation is tied to him now. Marilyn turned toward Claire. Can I see you for a moment? The room paused as they slipped out into the hallway. Marilyn closed the door behind them. Claire, we need to know where you stand. Where I stand, Claire repeated, her voice thinner than she expected. You've worked closely with Jonathan these past weeks. You've seen more of him than the rest of us have. Donors are asking whether our staff feels comfortable working under someone with this history. Claire's chest tightened. You're asking if I still want to work under him? Marilyn nodded. Yes, and I need an honest answer. Claire looked out the window toward the river. The water glistened under the morning sun, beautiful but unpredictable the way life tended to be. Her pulse beat hard against her ribs. She thought of what she'd seen Jonathan folding chairs in that fellowship hall, long after others had left. Jonathan calling out risks in his own development plan. Jonathan standing beside her in the darkened cottage during the storm, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Jonathan telling her he'd spent years trying to fix what he once got wrong. But the article's images wouldn't fade either. Children frail in hospital beds, families holding bottled water, the quiet devastation of communities overlooked by men who meant well but failed disastrously. "I don't know," she whispered. It was the truest answer she had. Marilyn studied her for a long moment. "Take the day. Think about it." When Marilyn walked away, Claire remained still, her back against the cool brick wall. Her thoughts spiraled. If she defended Jonathan, now did that make her naive, complicit? If she condemned him outright, did that make her hypocritical after seeing the man he was trying to become? A relationship built on mistrust was doomed, but so was one built on ignoring the full truth. A notification buzzed on her phone. Another article. Another flood of accusations. Claire closed her eyes. She felt caught between two coastlines, one defined by the past she could not excuse, and one shaped by the man she'd begun to believe he could be. And for the first time since meeting him, she had no idea which version of Jonathan Hale would rise on the next tide. Claire didn't knock. She stood outside his glass-walled office for a full 30 seconds, watching him through the pane. The late afternoon sun cast warm gold across the river. Beyond him, water rippling like something alive, almost comforting. His office, all clean lines and quiet elegance, felt like another world compared to the storm-battered neighborhoods she visited every week. He sat alone at his desk, hunched in a way she had never seen before. Files were spread across the polished wood, newspaper clippings, legal documents, printed screenshots. The scandal. All of it. He looked up when the door clicked open. "Claire." Her name left his mouth softly, like he was afraid it might break. She closed the door behind her, not because she wanted privacy, but because she didn't want anyone to hear her voice tremble. "We need to talk," she said. He nodded once. Slow. Heavy. "I know." Claire placed her binder on the edge of his desk. Not a slam, not an accusation, just a quiet, deliberate gesture. "I've read everything. The reports, the testimonies." She swallowed. "The photos." Jonathan didn't flinch, but his fingers curled slightly against the desk. "You were part of that project," she continued. "You signed the redevelopment documents. You profited from it." He didn't interrupt. Didn't defend himself. "When the contamination started showing up, you didn't act." Her voice thinned. "Or not fast enough." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying something inside. When he looked at her again, his expression was stripped bare. No boardroom, calm, no CEO precision. "I'm not going to tell you. I didn't know," he said quietly. "I saw early indicators. Small ones. A report that didn't line up. A delay in soil sampling that didn't make sense." He exhaled long and uneven. "But profits were surging. The partnership was celebrating. I told myself someone else was already looking into it." Claire felt her stomach tighten into a cold knot. "And you didn't push." "No." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't push." A silence settled between them, deep, raw, impossible to soften. He looked out toward the river, his profile outlined by fading sunlight. "Families had to move because of decisions I made," he said. "Children got sick. I carry that every day. I don't get to erase it." Claire expected excuses. Mitigation, evasion, anything but this quiet, unornamented confession. But Jonathan just sat there, shoulders bowed, hands open on the desk like he had no right to shield himself. "My mother fought a company that hid the truth," he said, "and then I became someone who didn't question the truth enough." He shook his head slowly. "That's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." Claire's throat tightened painfully. She wanted to scream, wanted to shake him, wanted to ask how the same man who waded through knee-deep stormwater to protect strangers could have once turned away from people who needed him just as much. But the words that came out were softer and sharper. "I don't know which version of you is real." He looked at her, then truly looked, eyes clouded with something she had never seen in him. Fear. Not the fear of losing money or status. Fear of losing her. "I'm trying to be better than the man I was," he said. "I've spent years changing my investments, my partnerships, my standards. Everything I've done with Coastal Futures. It's because I can't undo what happened there." Claire shook her head, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Trying isn't always enough. I know. His voice cracked for the first time. But I don't know how to undo the past except by what I choose now. Her breath trembled. The ache in her chest stretched wide like something tearing. Jonathan, she tried to steady herself, but her voice still broke. I can't be the one defending you to my patients if I'm not sure who you are. It was the kind of stillness that came only when a person had run out of defenses and out of hope. You're not sure, he repeated quietly. Claire wiped at her cheek, embarrassed by the tear that escaped. No, I'm not. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He simply absorbed the words like blows he knew he deserved. The evening sun dipped lower, casting warm copper across the river. Its reflection shimmered across his office, catching against the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting everything in a light that felt too gentle for a moment so brutal. She turned toward the door. Claire, he said, his voice barely audible. Please, she stopped. And I think you need to sit with what you've done, without me trying to make you feel better about it. He said nothing. The silence told her everything. She walked out, the soft click of the door, closing behind her, echoing far louder than it should. Outside the office, the wind off the river brushed cool against her skin, but nothing could steady the tremor in her chest. Inside, Jonathan remained alone with the river he was trying to protect, now years too late, and the consequences he could never outrun. And Claire felt with devastating clarity that nothing between them would ever be simple again. Claire didn't go home after leaving Jonathan's office. She drove instead to the old brick building that housed the free clinic, a place that had seen more broken bodies and tired spirits than any boardroom ever would. Its parking lot glittered with puddles from the evening rain, the kind that reflected street lamps like trembling lanterns. Inside, the familiar antiseptic smell hit her, a scent she associated with long nights, too thin budgets, and people who had nowhere else to go. She found Dr. Harold Green in exam room 2, carefully folding boxes of donated medical supplies. 75, stooped in the shoulders, slow in the knees, but sharp as ever. He had mentored Claire from her first year out of nursing school, teaching her how to listen to what patients weren't saying. He peered over his glasses when she entered. Well now, you look like you've been arguing with angels or devils. Hard to tell which from here. Claire sank onto the rolling stool. Maybe both. Tell me, he said, gently returning to his boxes but tilting his ear her way. So she did. She told him about the contamination scandal, the lawsuits, the families uprooted, and the way her heart twisted itself into something sharp and confused every time she tried to reconcile the man she'd seen in the rain with the man in the headlines. Dr. Green listened, nodding slowly, his expression never drifting toward judgment. When she finished, he placed a vial back into its tray with deliberate care. Anger's a natural response, he said softly. It's a sign your moral compass still works. Claire let out a shaky breath. I trusted him, maybe more than I should have. Yes, Dr. Green murmured. That's usually how disappointment gains its teeth. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, Do you know what he did last winter? She blinked. Who, Jonathan? Dr. Green nodded. The Hale Foundation paid off medical debt for 23 of our sickest patients. Quietly. No photos, no press, no gala speeches. One of them was Linda Ross, the woman who worked at that contaminated plant. Claire stared at him. Why didn't anyone tell me that? Because he didn't want anyone to know, Dr. Green said simply. Said he didn't deserve to be thanked for cleaning a mess he helped create. The words pressed into her chest, not softening the hurt, but complicating it. He could have publicized it, she said quietly. Used it to save his reputation. That's exactly why he didn't, Dr. Green replied. Guilt is a terrible companion, Claire. Makes some people hide, makes others fight, makes a rare few rebuild something better. She looked down at her hands, suddenly unsure of what she believed. Dr. Green wiped his glasses with a handkerchief older than most interns. You came here to ask whether a man with a dark mark can ever be trusted again. Claire didn't answer. Her silence did it for her. He continued, I've lived long enough to tell you this. Some men stay villains. Some spend the rest of their lives trying not to be. He rested a hand on her shoulder, light, warm, steady. You have to decide which one you're looking at. His words didn't absolve anything. They didn't erase children in hospital beds. They didn't rewrite legal documents or undo corporate failures. But they did land in her heart with the weight of truth. Later, Claire stopped at Coastal Futures to return a stack of files. Marilyn was still there, working late as usual, her office lamp glowing amber against the dark windows. "Claire," Marilyn said, looking up. "Walk with me a minute." They crossed the hallway to the small kitchenette. Marilyn poured coffee that smelled burned but comforting, the kind meant for conversations that couldn't wait until morning. "You should know something," Marilyn said, leaning against the counter. Before Jonathan ever took the board chair position, he insisted we strengthen our conflict of interest policies. Claire frowned. "Why would he do that?" "Because he didn't trust himself," Marilyn said plainly. "He wanted safeguards, real ones, so no developer, not even him, could manipulate our recommendations. He asked for stricter transparency rules, mandatory independent reviews." She paused. "He said he'd rather lose a project than repeat past mistakes." Claire stared at the floor, her pulse uneven. She hadn't known that. She hadn't known any of it. "He's not perfect, Claire," Marilyn added, "but I've worked with enough wealthy benefactors to know most don't ask for tighter leashes." Claire swallowed hard. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're trying very hard to see him clearly," Marilyn said, "and you deserve the full picture." When Claire left the office, the sky had deepened into a velvet blue. She drove toward the marsh, not Bayview Point, but the quiet stretch outside town where her mother used to bring her during hard weeks. A wooden bench sat crooked near the tall grass, its slats worn smooth by humidity and time. Claire sat there, drawing her knees close, listening to the rustle of reeds and the distant rush of water through the channels. She thought of her mother's voice, soft, certain. "Men in suits will offer promises big enough to cover every lie. Don't trust the words, baby. Trust the patterns. Trust what they break and what they mend." "But then, Doctor," Green's voice layered gently over it, "some men stay villains. Some spend the rest of their lives trying not to be." The marsh wind carried both truths, both warnings, both possibilities. Claire hugged her arms around herself, staring at the horizon where sky and water blurred together in a soft shimmer. She wasn't ready to forgive Jonathan. She wasn't ready to walk away either. She sat there until the sun slipped low, her thoughts swirling like tidewater, pulling, returning, rising again, searching for the line between who he was and who he might still become. The road out of Savannah thinned quickly, houses giving way to stretches of wild marshland, tall grasses shifting like waves in slow motion. Claire drove with her hands tight on the wheel, the late afternoon sun slanting low across the horizon. 15 miles, Marilyn had said. He's been spending weekends there, alone, as though isolation were a destination. Claire wasn't sure what she expected. A private estate, a sleek modern house overlooking the water, something that screamed billionaire exile. What she found instead made her pause. A weathered cottage on stilts, paint peeling in soft curls the color of old seashells. A screened-in porch sagged slightly at one corner, and the roof looked as though storms had left their fingerprints everywhere. His truck sat in the dirt driveway, spattered with dried mud, the back filled with buckets, rope, and a rusted toolbox. This wasn't a retreat, it was a reckoning place. Claire stepped out of her car. The marsh wind hit her face, salty, honest, carrying the sound of distant gulls and the soft click of fiddler crabs on wet sand. She followed a narrow path of warped planks until she reached the dock stretching into the marsh. Jonathan was there, old boots, faded jeans, a simple gray t-shirt that looked like it had been washed more by rain than by machines. He stood ankle-deep in the shifting tide, measuring water levels with a wooden pole marked in inches and hand-drawn notches. No assistants, no drone. Just him, and the water he kept trying to understand. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For a moment, neither spoke. His expression didn't hold the polished neutrality she was used to. It held something far more fragile. Surprise, relief, a flicker of fear. "Claire," he said quietly, "didn't think I'd see you here." She swallowed the words, slow to gather. "I wasn't sure I'd come." He nodded, accepting, not wounded. "Still, I'm glad you did." She walked onto the dock, stopping a few feet from him. The tide lapped against the wood, rising and falling like a breath between them. You've been measuring this yourself, she asked. Every weekend. Sometimes during the week, he lifted the pole, showing her the small marks made in ink. The models tell one story. The marsh tells another. I trust the marsh more. There was no boast in his voice, just truth. They stood in silence, watching the sunlight ripple across the water. Claire felt her pulse soften for the first time in days. Finally, she spoke. Why don't you go on television? Defend yourself, fight the accusations. People are making you into a monster. Jonathan rested the pole against the dock railing, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked out toward the horizon. Because the facts won't change, he said simply. Apologies won't change them. Interviews won't change them. Only what I do next can. His voice carried no self-pity, only conviction, worn thin from carrying too much weight for too long. Claire exhaled, feeling something heavy and tight inside her loosen just a little. You're really not running from any of it. No, he said. Running is what I did 10 years ago. Not again. The wind shifted, rustling tall marsh grass. A small heron lifted, sweeping low across the water, before disappearing around a bend. Jonathan reached for something leaning against the dock wall, a long metal cylinder dented in places secured with two clasps. He hesitated before holding it out to her. I've been waiting for the environmental review before showing this to anyone, he said. But I want you to see it. Claire opened the clasps. Inside were rolled blueprint-sized papers. She lifted them carefully as the wind tugged gently at the edges. Jonathan stepped closer, close enough she could feel the heat of him, but he didn't touch the plans he let her see first. The drawings weren't resort expansions. They weren't luxury cottages. They weren't market-rate condos or new investment properties. They were something different. Something smaller, something humbler, something intentional. At-cost shoreline reinforcement using natural buffers, oyster reefs, marsh grass restoration, sediment trapping embankments. Community-owned cottages on elevated stilts, built for families who'd been displaced years earlier. A health outpost designed to serve low-income residents, staffed part-time but equipped for emergencies. Footnotes listing nonprofit partnerships, sliding-scale models, and environmental science advisors. Claire looked up at him, stunned. This isn't the resort. No, he said softly. It's not. Who owns the land? He hesitated, gazing out at the marsh as though bracing himself for her reaction. I do, he finally said. I bought it back 3 years ago. The contaminated site, every acre. Claire's breath caught. She studied his face, searching for ego, for justification, for anything that made this a PR strategy. She found none. I've been working with scientists to restore it, he said. Slowly, quietly. The kind of restoration that doesn't get ribbon cuttings or press releases. But why keep it secret, she whispered. Because it's the least I owe them. He paused, and because I needed to do it for the right reason, not the public one. Claire stared at the plans again, her fingers trembling against the paper. The tide beneath them shifted, rising another inch against the wood. He watched her, carefully guarded but hopeful in a way that made her chest ache. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I know what I've done. I know what I failed to do. I just want you to see the full picture before deciding who I am. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. I'm trying. Jonathan nodded once, as if he knew how much effort those 2 words required. A gull cried overhead. The marsh wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and earth, and something older than both of them. Claire rolled the plans slowly and returned them to the metal tube. But her hands lingered a moment longer as though reluctant to let go. When she finally lifted her eyes to his, the vulnerability there scared her more than anything else had. She wasn't sure which direction she would move yet. But she'd taken the step, and somehow that mattered. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar and salt, the way old coastal homes do when they've endured more storms than birthdays. Inside, the floors creaked under Claire's steps as Jonathan led her toward a rough wooden table pushed beneath a window. The marsh beyond it was glowing gold in the fading light, a shimmering tapestry of grass and water. He set the metal tube down carefully, almost reverently, then unrolled the plans across the table. The paper smoothed out slowly, marked with hand-drawn notes, precise measurements and revisions in different colors, layer upon layer of thought. Claire leaned over, breath catching. This wasn't just a redevelopment proposal. It was a reimagining of what a community could be. Jonathan pointed to a cluster of small cottages. 2/3 of these, he said, are locked into long-term affordability. 99 years. No exceptions. No loopholes. Claire traced the boundary lines with her eyes. Who holds control? A community trust, he said. Residents elect board members. I don't get a vote, she blinked. That alone separated his plan from almost every redevelopment scheme she'd fought over the last decade. He moved to the next section. And here, clinic space. Focused on environmental health, monitoring water exposure, respiratory issues, long-term tracking, the things that were ignored before. His voice tightened at the end, not with defensiveness, but with regret. Claire felt it like a string pulled inside her. And this, he continued, tapping another block, is a legal support office. Title assistance, housing rights, disaster claims. Most families never stood a chance without lawyers. They won't go through that again. Claire stared at the plans. This wasn't the work of a man trying to repair a crack. This was a man rebuilding a shoreline grain by grain, refusing to let it collapse the way it had under his watch before. You'd need millions for this, she whispered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, buying out my old partners wasn't cheap. They didn't want to let go of the land. Not at the price I insisted on. Claire lifted her gaze to meet his. The marsh wind tapped lightly against the window, as if urging honesty between them. How much did it cost you? She asked softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Most of what I built. He let out a slow breath. Enough that my financial advisors think I've lost my mind. And have you? She murmured, half challenge, half fear. A small smile ghosted across his lips. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally sane. He walked around the table, resting both hands on the edge, palms flat against the wood. The plans stretched between them like an unspoken pact. He looked older in that moment, not worn but real, stripped of all the layers wealth had insulated him with. Then he said the words with a rawness that made her chest ache. If you think this is still about image, tell me now. She blinked. What, I mean it. His voice was steady, not sharp. If you believe I'm doing this to polish my reputation, I'll walk away from the public work. I'll step back from coastal futures. I'll spend whatever's left of my resources fixing what I can privately. He paused, eyes dark and honest. Because I'm tired, Claire. I'm tired of carrying the story alone. Tired of pretending I have all the answers. He didn't look away. Didn't try to soften the moment. Just waited. For her judgment, for her belief, for something he'd never asked of anyone permission to change. Claire's throat tightened. Green's quiet words of the patients whose debts were wiped clean without fanfare. She thought of the cottage, modest, worn, chosen deliberately over comfort or image. And she thought of the man who, for the first time since she met him, wasn't leading or defending or calculating. He was simply standing there, open. Vulnerable in a way she wasn't sure he'd ever allowed himself to be. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. Don't walk away. Something flickered in his eyes, hope barely daring to breathe. She stepped closer, her fingertips brushing the corner of the blueprint. Not if you're finally facing the right direction. He exhaled a long, shaking breath, as though those words had steadied something in him he'd been holding lopsided for years. The marsh outside hummed with twilight sounds, the rustle of reeds, the distant cry of birds heading inland, the whisper of water shifting with the evening tide. Inside, the air felt warmer. Not because anything had been fixed, but because something had reopened. A possibility. A harbor not yet built, but named. Jonathan didn't speak again. Not right away. He simply rested his hands on the table, close enough to hers that their fingers nearly touched but didn't. The kind of almost contact that said, we're not there yet, but we're closer. Claire felt her heart swell and tighten at the same time. Hope was a dangerous tide, it could lift or drown. She wasn't sure which way it was pulling her yet, but she didn't step back. As the sun slid beneath the marsh, casting the entire cottage into soft blue shadow, Claire realized something both comforting and terrifying. This wasn't just his turning point. It might be hers, too. And when she finally looked up, Jonathan was watching her, with an expression she couldn't read, half gratitude, half something she wasn't ready to name. Not yet. The tide outside kept rising, and neither of them moved. The weeks that followed unfolded in a rhythm neither Claire nor Jonathan had expected, something between a rebuilding effort and a fragile truce. Nothing had been forgiven outright, nothing forgotten, but the ground between them felt different now. Not steady, not safe, but possible. The first community planning session took place in the basement of Bayview Point's First Gospel Church. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum floors. A dozen crockpots lined a table near the back filled with donated casseroles. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like impatient insects. Claire stood at the center of a circle of residents, guiding the conversation the way she always did, firm but gentle, drawing out the quiet voices, softening the sharp ones. Not leading, just listening. His notebook filled with messy lines of handwriting she'd never seen from him. Scrawled thoughts. Instead of precise bullet points, sketches of shoreline barriers mixed with quotes from grandmothers who refused to be displaced. One more dang time. At one point, Mrs. Lorraine Hartwell, a 70-year-old firecracker with a cane and a memory like a steel trap, turned to him sharply. "You," she said. "Mr. Moneyman." Jonathan straightened. "You say you're different from the others. Fine. Then explain why your company made all that mess in Whalen Beach and waited till people were coughing blood before pulling the plug." A few residents sucked in their breath. Claire watched Jonathan carefully. He didn't dodge the question. "I failed them," he said plainly, "and I've been trying every day since not to fail anyone else." Mrs. Hartwell studied him for a long second, then sniffed. "Well, see that you don't." And that was that. The meetings multiplied, church basements, fire halls, libraries with mismatched folding tables. Residents from Bayview Point and the other coastal town came together, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, as they talked through fears that had lived in their bones for years. Claire stood at the heart of it all. Jonathan hovered at the edges, learning the hardest way possible by being humble. At night, their roles shifted again. The Coastal Futures office, once a place Claire had tried to avoid him, became something different, almost a workshop, almost a haven. They spread design revisions across conference tables, laptops glowing through the small hours. Empty coffee cups and takeout containers piled up around them like miniature monuments to exhaustion. One night, around 2 a.m, Claire drifted off mid-sentence in an old upholstered chair, her head resting against the wall. Jonathan looked up from a spreadsheet and paused. She was curled slightly, arms folded, her breathing soft and even. A strand of hair had fallen across her cheek. Jonathan stood hesitant, then shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. He did it slowly, as though afraid even his gentleness might wake her. She didn't stir. He returned to his seat with an expression Claire didn't see, something tender, conflicted, and quietly aching. Hours later, she woke with a start, blinking sleep from her eyes. "You should have shaken me," she murmured, adjusting his jacket around her. "You were exhausted," he said without looking up. It didn't seem fair. She eyed the half-burned smell coming from the microwave. "Did you try to heat something again?" he grimaced. "Trying implies a level of competence I do not possess." She laughed. Really laughed. The sound surprised them both. "And you," he added more softly, "hum when you're stressed." Claire nearly dropped her pen. "What, that hymn you hum? The one about shelter and storms?" He shrugged, a rare shyness edging into his voice. "It's nice." Their eyes met across a clutter of papers and cold coffee. Something shifted quietly, like tidewater creeping closer to the shore. Not romantic, not yet, but undeniably warm, and impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came 3 Thursdays later, after a marathon negotiation session with city planners and community representatives. Jonathan had ceded more control than any developer Claire had ever seen. Residents would hold a majority seat on the steering committee. They would have veto power over shoreline protections. They would review all environmental data before any shovel touched any soil. No one had expected it. Not even Claire. When the deal finally closed, paper-signing pens hit the table with exhausted triumph. People hugged. A few cried. Even the city planner, who never smiled, cracked something that looked almost like one. Outside, dusk had settled over the river, turning the water into a strip of silver. Claire and Jonathan stepped out of the building together, not intentionally, just carried by the same current of tired relief. They stood side by side at the railing, staring at the lights flickering across the Savannah River. For a moment, the world felt strangely still. Jonathan broke the silence first. "When you argued with me that night," he said, "I thought you were reckless." Claire's lips curved, not in offense, but in memory. "And when you walked on that stage, I thought you were unmovable." He let out a soft breath, half laugh, half confession. "Seems we were both wrong." "Seems so," she said. Their hands rested on the railing inches apart. The breeze lifted the edge of her sleeve, brushing his knuckles. Neither pulled away. A soft electric quiet settled between them, something fragile, warming, unnamed. Not a beginning, but the unmistakable start of one. Claire felt her heart tilt toward that truth cautiously, like a step taken on a dock that might or might not hold. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The shift had already happened, and it wasn't just in him. The backlash didn't come all at once. It came like a slow rising tide, small ripples spreading through the neighborhoods, long before Claire felt the pull beneath her feet. At first it was just murmurs, a comment overheard while she walked out of the clinic, a pointed glance at the grocery store. A voicemail from a patient saying, "Be careful who you sit beside, honey. Wolves look different these days." But then the murmurs sharpened. Flyers appeared on telephone poles in Bayview Point. Grainy black and white print, the kind run off on an old home printer, Hale's nurse. Sold out. Don't let her speak for us. Her stomach dropped the first time she saw one, taped crookedly beside the mailbox near a boarded-up house she used to visit weekly for wound checks. By the next morning, there were dozens. Some activists she'd marched beside for years began posting vague critiques online about nurses who forget where they come from. Messages filled her inbox, mostly supportive, but a few sharp enough to bruise. And worst of all were the quiet questions. Her patients, older, tired, worn thin by life, looked at her with tentative eyes and asked, "Are you still one of us, Claire?" Each time she answered, "Yes." Each time the answer felt harder to believe. The spiral began on a Tuesday morning. Claire sat alone in the clinic's break room, her coffee cold, her hands wrapped around the paper cup for warmth she couldn't find. Am I being used? Is he just letting me soften the blow? Did he let me get close because it benefits him? The questions gnawed at her ribs. It didn't matter that she'd seen his hands shaking when he described the children in Wayland Beach. It didn't matter that she'd watched him give up wealth, power, and comfort. It didn't matter that he'd changed because of his own conscience, not because she demanded it. Fear had its own logic, and fear, she'd learned, could ruin even the truest things. That afternoon, she found Jonathan on the top floor of the Coastal Futures building, leaning forward over a long table covered with updated budget projections. His sleeves were rolled up, hair slightly mussed, the exhaustion around his eyes unmistakable. He looked up when she entered. She didn't speak. He saw everything in her face anyway. A long silence stretched between them, familiar now but heavier than the others they'd shared. Then Jonathan closed the folder in front of him. "Claire," he said, voice gentle, "I know what's happening." She swallowed. "People are angry. They're scared," he corrected softly. "And they have every right to be." She looked down. "They think I've crossed a line." His expression tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to grief. "And you think, maybe they're not wrong." She took a trembling breath. "I don't know what to think." Jonathan stepped away from the table, hands in his pockets, a gesture she recognized by now, the one he used when he was holding himself back. "I never wanted you to carry the consequences meant for me," he said. "If it helps, I'll step back from the public side. I'll let the foundation take over the work. I'll keep funding it quietly." "You can keep leading without my shadow falling over you." Claire blinked. "You would do that," he nodded once. "Yes." His voice dropped. I don't ever want to be the reason you lose the community you love." The ache in Claire's chest deepened, slow and steady. He meant it. She could see it. He would disappear tomorrow if she asked. Fade behind the curtains, allow her to be the face of the work, pretend this was never personal. She'd fought him for months because she believed people could change. And now he was changing, truly changing, yet she was letting fear dictate who she was allowed to be. She thought of Mrs. Hartwell telling him, "See that you don't fail us again." She thought of Dr. Green's quiet reminder, "Some men spend their lives trying not to be villains." She thought of the late nights, the shared exhaustion, the careful brushing of hands, the blueprint spread between them like a fragile truce. Anger had been her anchor for so many years, steady, predictable, righteous, but anger wasn't the only loyal thing in her life. It wasn't even the bravest. She lifted her head. "No," she whispered. Jonathan froze. She took a step closer. "You don't get to step back, and I don't get to hide." He opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. "If you get to keep changing," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "then so do I." A breath left him, half relief, half disbelief. She continued, "I'm tired of letting fear write the ending. I'm tired of letting anger be the only thing I trust." She swallowed hard. "If we stand apart, people will keep choosing the story that hurts the most. But if we stand together, maybe they can choose something else." "Together," he repeated the word, almost reverent. "Together," she said again, steady this time. The last of the sunlight spilled across the conference table, illuminating the maps they'd spent nights revising, the notes in both their handwriting, the plan that was no longer his or hers alone. It belonged to everyone willing to believe in something larger than blame. Jonathan stepped closer, not touching, not claiming, just sharing the same breath, the same fragile hope. "Then we'll face them honestly," he said. Not as savior and assistant. She met his eyes. As what then? His answer was soft. "As people who owe this community the truth." Their hands brushed once more, accidental, inevitable. Neither pulled away. Outside, the river caught the last glow of dusk, a wide ribbon of light that felt like a promise neither of them fully understood yet. But they would. In time. If they kept walking toward it together. 1 year later, the coastline looked nothing like the renderings Claire once saw projected on glossy screens in hotel ballrooms. Gone were the luxury towers. Gone were the sweeping resort decks and private docks. Instead, low-rise cottages rose on sturdy pilings, weather-resistant, storm-conscious, painted in soft coastal blues and whites. A clinic no bigger than the old Bayview Point post office sat near the center of the development, its wide porch built with the intention of welcoming more than diagnosing. A simple community dock stretched out into the marsh, built not for yachts, but for fishing poles, crab traps, and neighborly conversations. Construction noises hummed in the background, hammers distant, saws the shuffle of gravel trucks. But beneath it all was the sound that had carried this project from dream to blueprint to earth. The marsh breathing. Alive, protected, respected for once. The Savannah resort, after months of battle, negotiation, and compromise, looked different too. Scaled back. Pushed farther inland. Wrapped in a broad buffer of protected marshland that the community demanded, and Jonathan helped secure, even at the cost of losing some investors. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was small. Intentionally so. No fireworks. No podium lined with logos. No camera crews pushing children aside for a better angle. Just a narrow boardwalk washed in morning sun, rows of folding chairs filled with elders who'd spent half their lives fighting for a place that would not abandon them again. Children darted along the railings, chasing each other with the wild joy that comes when the adults around them finally exhale. Claire and Jonathan stood near the back, not out of shyness, but because the moment didn't belong to them. They watched as Mrs. Hartwell Kane and all cut the ribbon with hands that trembled but did not yield. People clapped. Some cried, most simply breathed as if the air finally tasted right. Jonathan looked over at Claire, then quietly, with the same reverence he showed the marsh the first time she followed him to the cottage on stilts. "You should be up there," she whispered. He shook his head. "This isn't mine." She didn't argue. He was right, but she also knew this place would not exist without the work he'd done. Stepping into every uncomfortable truth, every late-night audit, every public meeting where strangers hurled accusations he didn't deflect. Changing didn't erase his past, but he'd changed anyway. That evening, long after the chairs were packed up and the children went home, clutching pieces of ribbon as souvenirs, Claire and Jonathan walked down a narrow boardwalk until they reached a weathered bench overlooking the water. The tide was rolling in, slow and steady. Wind stirred the cordgrass. Lights from the new cottages shimmered across the surface in small, hopeful reflections. Claire sat first, letting her hands rest in her lap. Jonathan lowered himself beside her shoulders, brushing hers lightly. An unspoken closeness formed not from impulse but from choosing the same direction day after day. She looked out toward the horizon and thought of her mother, of hurricanes of trailers flooded to the windows, of the grief that once hollowed her out. And she wondered what her mother would say now, seeing these cottages built on higher ground, seeing a clinic ready for the next storm, seeing her daughter sit beside a man she once would have feared. She'd like this, Claire murmured almost to herself. She always said the marsh deserved better. She was right, Jonathan said. After a moment he spoke again so softly she wasn't sure she was meant to hear. I still think about them, he said, the families from Wayland Beach. I wake up some nights wishing I'd seen the danger sooner. Claire turned, studying the lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones storms and regret had carved slowly over years. Regret doesn't disappear, he said, exhaling. Even when you try to make things right, I don't know if it ever will. She reached for his hand, not out of romance, not out of pity, but out of recognition. He didn't flinch. He didn't pretend the gesture didn't undo him a little. The tide always comes back, Jonathan, she said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. What matters is what we build so people aren't washed away again. The words settled between them like an anchor, not heavy but grounding. Jonathan looked at her, something tender and unguarded rising to the surface. For once, he didn't try to offer an answer or a vow or a plan. He just held her hand back, warm and steady, as if letting the silence finish the sentence for them. They watched the tide rise beneath the cottages, water lapping against the new pilings, each wave a reminder that storms would come again and again after that. But this time the homes would stand. This time the clinic lights would stay on. This time the people who lived here would not be forgotten when the water rose. Not a fairy tale, not redemption polished clean, just something real, something earned, something built not by perfect people, but by people who chose to keep showing up. As dusk settled into night, Claire leaned her head lightly against Jonathan's shoulder, and he didn't move away. The marsh hummed with life, the cottages glowed gold against the dark, and the river faithful, as always, carried their quiet victory into the coming tide. Sometimes healing begins where we least expect it. Not in perfect moments, not in victories, but in the quiet places where two people finally stop running from who they've been. Claire and Jonathan's story reminds us that life rarely gives us clean lines between right and wrong. Most of us live in the in-between places, trying, failing, getting back up, choosing again. And sometimes, the hardest thing isn't forgiving someone else. It's allowing ourselves to grow beyond the anger we've learned to cling to. What matters isn't whether we carry scars. We all do. What matters is whether we let those scars close us off. They come quietly through small choices, honest conversations, and the courage to see someone not for who they were, but for who they're trying to become. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we learn to stay standing even when the tide rises. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening with an open heart, and for believing in the quiet power of human stories. Every moment you share with this channel reminds us that kindness still has a place in the world, and that connection can be built one story at a time. If this tale touched something in you, even gently, we invite you to help it travel a little farther. Every like, every share, every subscribe is more than support for the channel. It's a way of spreading compassion, understanding, and hope to someone who may need it today. Thank you for being here with us. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul.